Of Robert Plant's 4 children, 3 were born to his first wife, but the identity of the 4th child's mother was the biggest bombshell of all. Robert Plant established himself as a force to be reckoned with early in his career. He would go on to become a legend of rock music in every sense of the word, but it took mountains of scandal, controversy, and tragedy to get there. Robert Anthony Plant was born on August 20th, 1948 in West Bromwich, Staffordshire, England. He had one sister named Alison who didn't follow his lead into the music industry. In fact, Plant's family was downright normal, even though their son Robert was anything but. Plant's family wasn't musical, at least not the same way he wanted to be. His father, Robert C. Plant, was a British engineer who worked in the army during World War II, while his mother Annie was of Romani descent. But while they didn't share his musical ambitions, Plant's parents supported his love of music, and as we'll see, this support allowed him to flourish. His enjoyment of music began at a young age, and he was especially fascinated with Elvis Presley. When I was a kid, I used to hide behind the curtains at home at Christmas, and I used to try and be Elvis. Always wanted to be, a bit similar to that. His attraction to flamboyant aesthetics only grew from there. Plant studied at the King Edward VI Grammar School for Boys until he was 16, but he left school after he developed a love for blues music, especially Willie Dixon and Robert Johnson. I could hear this kind of calling through the airwaves. Robert Plant wanted to make music like his idols, but he had no clue where it was going to take him. Plant had big dreams, but he still had his feet on the ground. Before stardom, he at least tried to find a traditional job for himself. He trained as a chartered accountant, but abandoned it 2 weeks into the program. If anything, school just made him realize what he needed to do. Plant immersed himself in the burgeoning blues scene in the English Midlands, and he would never turn back. To support his growing music renown, Plant worked a lot of odd jobs, including construction, laying down tarmac, and working at Woolworths. All the while, he was recording quirky singles at CBS Records and performing with several different bands. Networking is important for musicians, so when Robert met John Bonham, his spear made an abrupt shift. They formed a Band of Joy in 1966, which combined blues sounds with newer, more psychedelic musical trends. Not only that, but they became good friends too. That friendship would take the two of them to unimaginable heights and cost one of them their lives. When Robert's musical fame began to skyrocket in 1966, he met Maureen Wilson. They were enamored with one another immediately and married 2 years later in 1968, and Maureen gave birth to the couple's first child, Carmen, before the end of the year. They went on to have 2 more children, Carrick and Logan. In 1968, Robert had his big break. Jimmy Page was looking for a new singer for his band The Yardbirds and heard of Robert through another musician. Rather than auditioning Robert officially, Jimmy went to one of his performances at the Teacher Training College in Birmingham. Robert sang Somebody to Love by Jefferson Airplane, and Jimmy was awestruck. His search for a new lead singer was over, and a new friendship was formed. Little did they know, their relationship would change the music industry forever. Robert and Jimmy started with blues music, and the Yardbirds became the New Yardbirds in 1969. To commemorate their new musical endeavors, this new iteration included Page, Plant, Bonham, and bassist John Paul Jones. But rather than set them up as a world-renowned blues band, their first album would take an unexpected direction. In 1969, Led Zeppelin was officially born. They scrapped the name The New Yardbirds and released their self-titled first album under the new moniker. Led Zeppelin is broadly considered the start of a new musical genre, heavy metal, but Plant didn't necessarily agree with the classification. Robert disagreed that their work was heavy metal. In fact, he was so vocally against the label that he stated in a 1994 interview for MTV, "It's journalistic complacency and claptrap." Around 1/3 of their songs were acoustic. Plant felt misconstrued by the label that didn't describe their nuanced discography. When the interviewer asked if they wanted to set the record straight, Robert said, "No, it's not that bloody serious. Let people think what they like." In 1969, Plant made his first foray into songwriting and lyric writing for the band. According to Jimmy Page, it took a lot of ribbing to get him into writing. Regardless of his reluctance, Robert would go on to write some of the most memorable Led Zeppelin songs, such as the Rain Song. Plant drew on many inspirations for his writing, including Norse and Welsh mythology, referring to gods, Vikings, and warriors from both mythologies. Songs like Immigrant Song, which refers to Valhalla and Viking conquest, became his medium to explore his fascination. Plant also drew inspiration from J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit in particular. He wrote The Battle of Evermore, Misty Mountain Hop, and Over the Hills and Far Away, which all have lines referring to the legendary fantasy series, but that didn't mean every song lingered in the realm of myth. Plant also loved writing about real-life issues, like the obsessive nature of love and the temptations of desire. His writing spanned a wide variety of topics and themes, and he drew on many different sources to inform his writing. Plant was also fascinated with the African and specifically Moroccan music. He stated that he was intrigued by the scales initially and obviously the vocal work. He and Jimmy Page would both heavily draw on these musical stylings later in their work. Plant wrote the lyrics to Led Zeppelin's most legendary song, Stairway to Heaven, in 1970. The ballad came about extemporaneously during a recording session, and yet it would go on to become one of the most popular songs of all time, despite garnering one of the most classic types of controversy to strike rock music. A televangelist named Paul Crouch claimed that Stairway to Heaven contained satanic verses when played backwards, and it wasn't totally unfounded, as some of the song did indeed sound a little similar, though according to members of Led Zeppelin, it was a complete coincidence. Robert refuted the claim and said, "Who on earth would have ever thought of doing that? You've got to have a lot of time on your hands to even consider that people would do that." In 1969, Led Zeppelin made a horrible mistake involving a 17-year-old groupie. They were touring in Seattle with the band Vanilla Fudge when the managers for both bands participated in Seattle tradition, fishing from their waterfront room window. Reportedly, they even caught a mud shark. John Paul had a 17-year-old groupie in his room with him and the Vanilla Fudge drummer. When the managers arrived, they convinced the groupies to take off their clothes. At that point, they began using the shark to harm the teenager. At this point, the rest of the band became involved in the scene, and it didn't stop there. Robert said of the incident, "We were invited to bring our wives to take a look, but after a while we left because it was all a bit unsavory." Unfortunately, this event would permanently affect the groupie, but it wouldn't be the end of Led Zeppelin's questionable actions. When they toured in the 1970s, Robert Plant assumed a stage persona with a ton of charisma. He was a classic rock and roll leading man with a huge head of blonde hair and shirts unbuttoned or entirely absent. His curated appearance fit the rock and roll vibe perfectly. In his heyday, Robert Plant was incredibly physical on stage, using dancing, clapping, and wild gestures in time with the songs that he sang. The persona even had a name, Percy. In a word, he was vivacious, and his persona was so entrancing that it contributed to the world's image of the rock god. Plant's chest was so prominent in the performances that he won a strange award from Rock Scene magazine, Chest-O-Rama. Magazine readers voted for rock music's best chest, and Robert won. On the subject, he said, "It's hard for me to be eloquent on the subject of my chest." Robert never bothered with the Zeppelin groupies, partially due to being married and partially because he felt sorry for the young girls and their intense obsessions with the band. He even said as much during a 1975 interview. Unfortunately, his fellow band members didn't share his opinion. At the same time, Jimmy Page was having an affair with a girl half his age. In 1973, thieves targeted Led Zeppelin. The band was performing at Madison Square Garden when the hit happened. They lost $200,000 all in $100 bills, and their credit cards. The show went on as their hotel turned into the scene of an investigation, but there were still concerns for the band's safety. Authorities pinned their manager as the prime suspect alongside a bellman. While the band was relaxing in an apartment nearby, the manager was cleaning any clandestine substances from their hotel room. To this day, the case remains unsolved and the manager is still the main person on the hook for the incident. Robert was able to see the humor in the situation and said that he and Jimmy laughed about it. He thought it somehow made sense for someone to target them, but it wasn't that hard for them to laugh it off at that point. The band was so successful that $200,000 was basically pocket change. The band was at its peak during the early 70s, and Robert and his fellow band members were pushing themselves to the limit. If it wasn't performances and travel, it was threats to their security and rumors about their escapades. Bob Spitz, writer of Led Zeppelin the biography, said, "It was becoming too much to handle. The guys were in a daze." All this madness came to an abrupt halt. In 1975, Robert and his wife Maureen endured a terrible accident. They were in a car wreck that left Robert unable to perform for months afterward. He even spent time in a wheelchair during his recovery. All band endeavors ceased while he healed. Misfortune struck again in 1977. Plant's son Karak, born in 1972, contracted a stomach illness. At the time, Robert was with Led Zeppelin doing a makeup US tour, after they'd postponed the tour in 1975 due to his car accident. That meant Plant wasn't at home when his son fell sick. Soon after Plant arrived in New Orleans, he received 2 calls from his wife. The first, which said his son had fallen ill, was scary enough. The second brought everything crashing down. In a whirlwind, Karak succumbed to his illness. Their little boy was gone. Led Zeppelin cancelled the tour. All Plant wanted to do in that moment was be with his family. He didn't want to participate in anything band-related. He stopped indulging in substances almost immediately and even debated quitting Led Zeppelin altogether. The band's trajectory changed after Robert lost his son. His happy-go-lucky, flamboyant persona took a background role, and Robert focused on being authentic. He didn't want to be part of clamor and chaos, and their album In Through the Outdoor reflected this sentiment. Tragedy struck the band again in 1980. John Bonham, the drummer, was hospitalized after he collapsed during a performance. According to the band, John had eaten too much prior to the concert, but the press speculated it had to do with substance abuse. Prior to a rehearsal on September 24, 1980, mere months after his hospitalization, John Bonham still drank recklessly. Rehearsal ended late that night, and John passed out after. He was put to bed on his side, but the following day, around 1945, he was found asphyxiated on his own vomit. Led Zeppelin officially announced their breakup in December of 1980, to the surprise and sadness of many fans. They released a statement that said they couldn't continue with the deep sense of undivided harmony that came with their immense loss. On John's passing and the end of Led Zeppelin, Robert Plant said, "I floundered around a lot." After the disbandment, Plant struggled to find a place for himself in his new post-Zeppelin life. He briefly considered becoming a teacher, and he received an acceptance into teacher training. This safe path was tempting, but he was still drawn to the music life. Robert began his solo career in 1981 and found surprising support in a fellow famous musician. Phil Collins took the time to support Robert at the start of his solo pursuits, going as far to say, "Anything I can do to help you to get back into fighting shape again, I'm here." It took a long time for Plant to grieve Led Zeppelin's dissolution, but after working with Phil Collins and making his solo album Fate of Nations, he said, "I finally did find my way out of the passing of Led Zeppelin." He continued to hold his experience in the band very close to his heart. As Robert Plant mourned the loss of his son, his bandmate, and now the band that made him famous, he faced one last bit of domestic strife. He and his wife Maureen divorced in 1983 after almost 2 decades together. But this didn't keep the singer down for long. Led Zeppelin has returned in brief flashes since its initial disbandment in 1980, the key figure missing in their late bandmate John Bonham, but in 1985 the remaining members performed together at Live Aid with Tony Thompson on drums, but they would have another performance that would be an even better tribute to John. Later in 1988, Led Zeppelin reunited once more. This time they had Bonham's son Jason on drums, but it wasn't the perfect reunion they envisioned. Their set was short and unrehearsed, and Robert said the performances were like sleeping with your ex-wife but not making love. That is to say, he felt John's absence a little more that day. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted Led Zeppelin into their ranks in 1995, which was a monumental achievement. Robert performed alongside the living original members and several other musicians to commemorate the occasion. In addition to his solo music, Robert continued to collaborate with Jimmy Page for a long time afterwards. The two even released a couple albums together, No Quarter, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant Unleaded in 1984, and Walking into Clarksdale in 1998. To Robert's dismay, their second album wasn't successful and he made a difficult choice. During his and Jimmy's tour, the Page and Plant Unleaded tour, Robert was in a relationship with British singer Najma Akhtar. She even sang alongside them on the tour. Their relationship only lasted 2 years, from 1993 to 1995. This wasn't the last singer that Robert would engage with romantically. After several years of rumors, Robert agreed to perform in another Led Zeppelin reunion set. It was 2 full hours and featured Jason Bonham on drums again. The performance created a huge desire for a full-on tour, and they offered Robert $200 million to tour with the band. One of Robert's most famous collaborations was in 2007 to 2009 with Alison Krauss, a fellow blues singer-songwriter. They recorded several albums together and won awards for their works. One of the songs they recorded was a cover of a song Plant wrote with Page on their unsuccessful album, for which Allison and Robert won a Grammy. Rumors circulated about Robert and Allison's relationship. She was in her early 20s when they met, with Robert being in his early 60s. Their chemistry was undeniable, even to the two involved. All Robert said on the subject of their relationship was, "We have a musical one, because if we had a romantic one, we'd be in trouble now." Rumors of a Led Zeppelin reunion tour were rampant after their 2007 performance. Despite the enthusiasm of Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, Plant was reluctant to do a full tour with Led Zeppelin. His reason for rejecting the offer was surprising. Responding to the pressure to tour, Robert said he would not tour like a bunch of bored old men following the Rolling Stones around. He even went as far as to say any Led Zeppelin tickets being sold were fake. but this back and forth behavior garnered some ire from fellow bandmates. Jimmy Page expressed his frustration with Robert, stating he was fed up with Robert refusing to play, and even went so far as to claim Robert was just playing games and I'm fed up with it. Robert and Jimmy's continuing quarrel has the two men bickering over who said what, much to the dismay of many fans. It has resulted in a no-contest stalemate. In 2014, Jimmy even claimed that despite Robert expressing interest, he would have no intention whatsoever of doing it. In 2009, Robert was decreed Commander of the Order of the British Empire for his musical contributions. Not only that, but King Charles III invested Robert that same year. Back when King Charles was Prince of Wales, recognition of this tier was an honor for Robert. Robert brought his old band name into the 21st century. Band of Joy, featuring an all-new lineup, toured the US in 2010. They had a good year, but Robert said goodbye to the band at their last show in 2011.
For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details.
Hints about his next band swirled for the first time in 2012, and they first performed a gig in Gloucester in May of that year. The band's name, The Sensational Space Shifters. It featured about 10 different members and featured American singer Patty Griffin prior to her album release. At the same time as Sensational Space Shifters was starting, Robert said he and Patty Griffin had eloped and ran off to Texas, by which he meant he was staying with her in the state. But they indeed confirmed their romantic relationship, and the two dated for over a year. Unfortunately, fundamental differences pushed them apart. Robert said that Patty didn't like cider as much as he did. He also said that he would confuse her with who he became when he drank, and described his inebriated feelings as ones of sadness and regret. It's unclear whether Robert found love since then, but he filled the void with music. In 2018, the UK Americana Honours and Awards honoured Robert. They granted him the AMA Lifetime Achievement Award for his extensive discography, which at that point was immense. But this wasn't the only award he received for his artistic endeavours. Robert started another band in 2019 called Saving Grace. This time it was an acoustic-focused small-scale effort. After playing a couple of events the year they formed, they booked a US tour which was slated to start in March 2020. Unfortunately, the global COVID-19 pandemic foiled their plans and forced them to reschedule. Even after all these years, Plant has remained a major part of the music community in England, where he continues to live after all the raucous events of his life. When a music venue in Bath, the Bell Inn, was set to close in 2013, Plant swooped in to save the day. He contributed to a community-based purchasing plan to save the venue. Plant contributed to a GoFundMe page in 2020. A small-scale clothing company ran the funding page in Kidderminster, and they made scrubs for nearby hospitals. His contribution likely went a long way towards covering the cost of manufacturing. Robert Plant's legacy persists to this day. The impact he and Led Zeppelin had on the musical landscape continues to have a ripple effect on 21st century artists. Many singers have claimed Robert as an inspiration for their sound and vocal effects. Robert should be proud of what he has done with his musical work. After his divorce from Maureen, Robert Plant made an interesting choice for his next lover. He began dating Maureen's younger sister Shirley. More than that, he and Shirley had a child in 1991. Yet, with classic rock and roll laissez-faire, he and Maureen continued to be friendly, and they all spent most holidays as a family. Led Zeppelin was never the same after the passing of Robert Plant's son, Karak. While John Bonham was a major support for Plant after his son's passing, the other band members were the complete opposite. Jimmy Page and bassist John Paul Jones declined to even come to the boy's funeral. Robert was totally disillusioned by Jimmy after this, and the rift would only serve to set the band up for failure. Plant was so close to leaving the band that Jimmy Page panicked. He convinced Robert to stay and even went so far as to say, "Without him, the band's nothing." Even after the major insult of his absence at Karak's funeral, Page earned back some respect in that moment, but Led Zeppelin would never really be the same. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.